All right, hi guys. So this is the first video for our chapter on the spinal cord. So in this video, we are going to go through most of the kind of anatomy and the structure of the spinal cord and how information enters and exits the spinal cord. And then in the second video, we're going to talk about reflexes, which only travel through the spinal cord, right? They don't require input from the brain to occur. Okay, so let's dive into the spinal cord. All right, so first of all, just a reminder. So with motor information, remember motor information is going to be sent from the brain. All right, and then it is going to travel descending through the spinal cord. All right, and then it's going to leave the spinal cord. All right, so it'll be efferent. Okay, and so we're going to try to keep our sensory and our motor organized in this chapter. Okay, and then with sensory information, it's coming from the periphery. All right, and it goes to the spinal cord, so it's moving afferent. And then when it reaches the spinal cord, it travels up, so it's ascending. Okay. All right, so that's our motor and our sensory. So just a kind of overview of the anatomy of the spinal cord first. The spinal cord itself is about 18 inches long. It extends from the foramen magnum, right, in the bottom of the skull, all the way down to about lumbar vertebrae number 1. Okay. It is approximately about an inch or less than an inch wide. All right, so that's what we're seeing here. So it would be about an inch or less wide, and it travels through the vertebral foramen of your vertebrae. And if you remember, that's this big hole here in the middle of the vertebrae. So it travels through that vertebral foramen, and it is surrounded, just like the brain, by meninges. So let's review the layers and kind of look at and see what's a little different with the spinal cord compared to the brain. All right, so our outermost layer, again, just like the brain, is the dura mater. So if we were to point to it on this picture, all right, it's right here. So it's this layer right here. All right, so this outer layer. Okay, so that's the dura mater, the outermost layer. It's really dense connective tissue. One unique thing with the spinal cord is that how we had in the brain, our dura directly up against the skull. In the spinal cord, there's actually this layer of fat between that dura mater and the bone. All right, and this forms a space called the epidural space. All right, so that's the epidural space. It contains a lot of fatty tissue, all right, that helps to kind of cushion that spinal cord. So fat or adipose tissue is in that epidural space. And so this area is where, if you get an epidural, right, epidural anesthesia, like some women do during labor and delivery, it will be injected into this fat. All right, so that anesthesia, the needle for that anesthesia is put through the space between your vertebrae and into this fat and injected there, right? It should not puncture your meninges, okay? And so then it can kind of numb the sensation, all right, from that level, typically kind of down, right? Okay. So that's the epidural space. Then just like in the brain, we have deep to the dura, we have our arachnoid mater. You can see that here. All right. So kind of point to it here. Okay. That is our, well, that's good enough. All right. So that's our arachnoid mater. Just like in the brain, there's this large space, right? Actually, all of this space, and you can kind of see some of these spider web-like fibers here from that arachnoid. This is the subarachnoid space, okay? That subarachnoid space is where our CSF is going to be circulating around our spinal cord. All right, so it's going to be in that subarachnoid space, all in here. All right. And it's also going to be located in the central canal, which runs down the middle of the spinal cord. So we'd have CSF moving through the central canal and the subarachnoid space. And then our last layer of meninges is the pia mater. Okay? So the pia mater, just like on the brain, right? The pia mater sits directly on top of the brain. Here it sits directly on top of the spinal cord. All right, so it's sitting on the spinal cord, and it actually extends into these kind of grooves or fissures in the brain or in the spinal cord, and that is the pia mater. Okay. All right, good. So those are the layers, the meninges on the brain, or sorry, on the spinal cord. So now let's talk about kind of when we're looking at the spinal cord lengthwise, some important structures to point out. Okay. So again, the spinal cord extends from the foramen magnum in the skull down to about lumbar vertebrae number 1 or 2. All right, and so you can see that actually kind of right about here on this picture is where that spinal cord ends. Okay, so it actually doesn't go all the way down to the sacrum. It ends at about lumbar vertebrae number 1. All right, and the point where that spinal cord ends, right about here, is called the conus medullaris. All right, so that is the point of the spinal cord at L1 where it ends. So the spinal cord comes to a point, and then from there, and they're showing it in green here, the pia mater actually continues to extend downward, and it anchors onto the coccyx bone. Okay, so the pia mater extends and anchors to the coccyx. That is called the filum terminale. Okay, so it goes from the end of the spinal cord, that conus medullaris, all the way down to the coccyx, and it helps to actually anchor the spinal cord in place. All right, it helps to kind of hold it down in place. All right, so we can also see that all along the spinal cord here, we have all these nerves extending off of either side. All right, these are called spinal nerves. All right, so spinal nerves are mixed, meaning they are both motor and sensory. Okay, there are 31 pairs, meaning you have 31 spinal nerves left and right, right? So they're paired. There's a left and right. And they leave the spinal cord through the intervertebral foramen. And if you remember, that's the hole that forms when you put two vertebrae together. Okay, so if we look back up at our previous picture where we can see our vertebrae, when you stack this vertebrae with another one, you get a hole that forms here. That's the intervertebral foramen. Our spinal nerves can enter and exit through that intervertebral foramen. So this would be a spinal nerve here and another spinal nerve here. Okay? So we have our spinal nerves running all the way down. Again, 31 pairs. All right, so we go from C1 to C8, and then T1 through 12, L1 through L5, and then S1 through S5 refers to those spinal nerves that leave through the foramina in the sacrum. Okay, so that would be down here. All right, and actually this kind of becomes a little unique, right, with these particular spinal nerves and some of the lumbar spinal nerves, because they're not extending directly off of the spinal cord and going straight out through those intervertebral foramen. If we zoom in, you can see that this is our conus medullaris again. Right? They're actually extending from that conus medullaris and going down until they reach that intervertebral foramen. All right, and they form this kind of tail-like structure here, which is called the cauda equina. All right, so all of this is cauda equina. So those are the nerves that extend off of the bottom of the conus medullaris. It means horse's tail, and that's kind of what it looks like. All right, and they extend and then leave out of their particular intervertebral foramina. All right. And then lastly, with our spinal cord, you can see in certain regions it's slightly enlarged. So here and here, it's bulged a little more. Those are our enlargements. So there's a cervical enlargement. Cervical meaning it's at the neck. All right, so that would be our enlargement here. And you have a lumbar enlargement here. Okay, so the reason there's a cervical enlargement is because that is the point where the nerves for the arms enter and exit. Okay. And then the lumbar enlargement is similarly for the legs, right? So this is where the nerves for the legs enter and exit. All right, so that's kind of our overall structure of the spinal cord. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at a cross section of the spinal cord, and we're going to look at how that gray matter and white matter and the different nerves are arranged. All right, so this is our cross section of the spinal cord. And so when we're looking at it, first off, to kind of orient ourselves, right, we have our central canal that's here in the middle. Remember, CSF will travel through that. And then our spinal cord is divided into horns and columns. Okay, and so horns are going to be our gray matter. All right, remember, gray matter contains primarily cell bodies and some dendrites. And so those horns are going to be made up of cell bodies and dendrites. So you can see those here. All right, so all of this, these would all be horns, all gray matter all throughout here. All right, so those are the horns. And then the columns are going to be our white matter. All right, and remember that white matter primarily contains our myelinated axons. Okay, we're going to talk in a minute after we finish going through this cross section about how those horns and columns are arranged, and they have certain names just based on their location. So we'll look at that in a second. But I want to talk first about how sensory and motor information is organized in the spinal cord. Okay, so let's start with sensory information. All right, so we have, when we're looking at the spinal cord here, all right, again, we have here would be our spinal nerve, okay, and remember, spinal nerves are mixed. So they contain both sensory and motor information, all right, and so we would have sensory information coming in from the outside. Remember, it's afferent, so it's moving towards the spinal cord. And what it's going to do is it's going to travel through this structure here. So it enters the spinal cord dorsally, all right? And so there's an important structure you need to know right here on the spinal cord. It's this kind of bulge that comes just after the spinal nerve, and it's called the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, and if you remember, a ganglion is just a collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. All right, and this ganglion, the dorsal root ganglion, contains the cell bodies for sensory neurons. All right, so these are sensory neurons that are moving afferent towards the spinal cord. Okay, so they're going to be moving in here. All right, their cell body is going to be located here. They'll extend an axon that will continue towards the spinal cord. That axon is going to be traveling through this structure here, which is called a dorsal root. Okay, so to kind of follow that pathway, all right, the information, sensory information, moves afferent, all right, through that spinal nerve. There's a cell body for that neuron in the dorsal root ganglion, and then it sends an axon that travels through the dorsal root to reach the spinal cord, where it's going to synapse with another neuron in one of the horns on the dorsal part of the spinal cord. Okay? So that's our sensory information. So sensory is afferent with the cell body in the dorsal root ganglion, and then it sends its axon through that dorsal root. All right, so now let's talk about motor information. All right, so our motor neurons, the cell bodies, typically are going to be located in one of these horns on the ventral part of the spinal cord. All right, so this would be motor cell body. We'll talk about what that horn is called in a minute. Okay, but it sends its axon out through this structure here, which is called the ventral root. So it sends it out of the front of the spinal cord ventrally, travels through the ventral root, and then it is going to leave through this spinal nerve, right? It'll leave the vertebral column and go out to its muscle. Okay? All right, so that's how motor and sensory are organized. Motor travels through the ventral side, all right, through that ventral root towards the ventral horn in the spinal cord. And then sensory travels through the dorsal side with the cell body being in the dorsal root ganglion. All right, so let's talk about the names of the horns and the columns. All right, so we're going to start with our horns. These names are very simple. They're just based on location. And so you may also, I'm going to point out now, see, just depending on where you look, if you look online or your textbook, it varies the name that they use, just because dorsal you can also use posterior, and ventral you can also use anterior. So posterior horn is the same as a dorsal horn. Ventral horn is the same as an anterior horn. Just make sure, kind of pick one that you want to learn. I typically stick with dorsal and ventral, just because I always learned with the dorsal root ganglion that's what it's called, and it's never really been any other, term to me. So everything else is dorsal and ventral with the spinal cord. But if you're more comfortable with posterior, anterior, that's totally fine too. Okay, so we have, for the horns, we have dorsal horns, so they'd be both on the left and the right. Whoops, switch to the pen. All right, so we'd have a dorsal horn here, and we have a dorsal horn here. And then we have ventral horns. This is where those motor cell bodies are located. So we have a ventral horn here and a ventral horn here. All right, and so then on some sections of the spinal cord, primarily in the thoracic region, there are also lateral horns. Whoops. All right, and so they're just going to be on the side like this yellow patch here. And these are going to be important when we talk about the autonomic nervous system. All right, so don't worry about those as much now. Just know that it's called the lateral horn, and we'll talk about its function later. Okay, so we have dorsal horns, ventral horns, and lateral horns. And then for the column, it's pretty much the same thing. All right, so we have our dorsal columns. All right, so that would be here and here. We have our lateral columns, which are on the side. And so they're just breaking it down, the colors based on kind of motor versus sensory. All right, so these would all be lateral columns. These would be our dorsal columns. All right, and then here and here are our ventral columns. Okay. Good, right? So names that kind of make sense. I like that, right? That's always helpful. Okay, and so something to point out that'll be really helpful, especially in the next chapter that we go through about some of the different pathways, is some terminology. All right, so with the different tracts, and these tracts would be running through our columns, all right, if they're ascending sensory tracts, they would be named spino something, right? Meaning that they are starting in the spinal cord and traveling towards some region, right? So an example that we'll learn is spinothalamic. So it's going from the spinal cord to the thalamus, which is our sensory relay station. Okay, so if a tract starts with spino, that typically means it's going to be sensory. All right, and then for our motor tracts, remember these are our pyramidal cells that start in that primary motor cortex. All right, that pyramidal cell is typically called the upper motor neuron, which we're going to talk about in our next chapter. They descend through the spinal cord, and so sometimes these are going to start with cortico, just meaning they're starting in the cortex. All right, so an example of this would be corticospinal tract, meaning it goes from the cortex to the spine, right, or the spinal cord. So I'm just pointing this out because when you see these terms, there's going to be a lot of terms for kind of stuff moving through the spinal cord. Don't let the amount of information overwhelm you. Just try to take a second and break down the word and its parts and see if you can make sense of it on your own without even having to look it up, right? Gather some information just based on the kind of root words that make it up. All right, and then I just want to point out one last thing while we're talking about motor tracts, and that is, and we've talked about these a little bit before, but flaccid versus spastic paralysis. All right, so flaccid paralysis involves the inability to make a muscle actually contract, versus spastic is like a muscle spasm. So the muscle is kind of in a constant state of contraction. And so these differences come from, and they can both originate from spinal cord damage, but it actually comes from where on the spinal cord that damage occurs. All right, so is it from that pyramidal cell that's bringing the actual initial motor information down? All right, or is it from some other kind of influencing neurons that maybe are not giving the level of inhibition that they should be, and that will kind of affect the type of paralysis. And again, we'll look at this a little more when we do our next chapter as well. Okay, so our last topic for this video is plexuses. All right, and so a plexus is just a nerve that has formed from several spinal nerves that have kind of woven together and, you know, formed like a spider web almost, and then you get a nerve that branches off, and you know, we named some of those nerves. They go to different muscles and are really important. All right, but a plexus is that actual mesh, right, that web of nerves. Okay, and so we have a few different, three specifically different plexuses that are really important. All right, and our first one is the cervical plexus. So cervical means neck. All right, and so that's going to tell us it'll be at the neck. So this is our cervical plexus. Okay, and so you can kind of see, all right, all of these nerves. Spinal nerve comes off, right, and it weaves with the one above it and the one below it, and then they send branches out and all over the place, forming this kind of web. That is the plexus. Okay, and so you should know for each of these some important nerves that come from them. So from the cervical plexus, a really important nerve is the phrenic nerve. All right, this is the nerve that controls the diaphragm, which is our major breathing muscle. Okay, so it's critical. That is the skeletal muscle that we use to breathe. Okay, so a very, very important nerve in that cervical plexus. And then below that, we have a brachial plexus. So brachial means arm. All right, so it's going to be this plexus here that kind of extends nerves out to the arm. All right, so many of these nerves are going to go to different muscles of the arms, right, and the shoulders. So some examples are the ulnar nerve, the radial nerve, the median nerve, and the musculocutaneous nerve. All right. Good. Okay, so our last two plexuses, all right, are going to be for the lower extremities. So throughout these thoracic spinal nerves, right, we don't really have any plexuses that form until we reach here at the lumbar region. Okay, and so in the lumbar region, we have our lumbar plexus. Coming from that lumbar plexus, the really important nerve is the femoral nerve. Okay, and so the femoral nerve is going to supply a lot of the muscles to the front part of the thigh. All right, those anterior thigh muscles. All right, the quadriceps. And then our last plexus is our sacral plexus here. Okay, so that sacral plexus, one of the major nerves that comes from that is going to be the sciatic nerve. All right, the sciatic nerve controls the hamstrings, the posterior thigh muscles. Okay, so those are the plexuses, a few nerves you should be familiar with that come from each of them. All right, and so lastly, with our section on the spinal cord here, I just want to mention dermatomes because dermatomes are really fascinating. So by definition, a dermatome is a segment of the skin that's supplied by a specific spinal nerve. All right, so you can kind of localize like this specific segment of skin is supplied by this single spinal nerve, and it goes into these like patches. You can actually look up pictures where they map it out, right? It's in like these blocks, all right? And so one reason this is really interesting is because it plays a major role in shingles. So if you've ever known anyone that has shingles, what it does is it's from the chickenpox virus, and it travels through the nerves. So it travels through a spinal nerve to a specific dermatome and causes the skin in that dermatome to become really inflamed. Okay, so shingles affects specific dermatomes. Okay, and so you'll see this very defined kind of border for shingles of where the inflammation for the skin is occurring because it is only isolated to that specific dermatome. And then another use for this that's really interesting is to medical professionals and doctors that are familiar with these dermatomes and know a lot about them. If you tell them you're feeling pain or numbness in just a specific area of skin, they can then localize that to where along the spinal cord, like what spinal nerve is possibly being affected to cause that. All right, so they can be very important in a medical setting. All right, so that's it for this video. And so in the next video, we are going to talk about reflexes.